One, two, three, four. Okay, so today's class, today is 23 of April. We're gonna start from where we were before, which is just making a short summary between GDP and GNP. We just mentioned about the difference between GDP and GNP, and the main difference is that the GNP is the GDP plus the net factor income. And we said the net factor income is the income of citizens of a country or people from a particular country, even if they are producing abroad, when they send their money back to their country, that is going to be added to the GDP. Actually, to the GDP when we are calculating the GNP, minus the income of foreigners who are working inside the country or foreign firms that are investing in that country, which are sending back to their home countries their profits or repatriating their wages or any source of income that they have. So the GNP will be then smaller or bigger than the GDP, depending on that flow of net factor income. If the net factor income is bigger, the outflow than the inflow, then the GNP will be smaller than the GDP. It means that inside the boundaries of the country is being produced more, but the citizens of that country or the residents of that country are not all citizens, and they are sending money to their home countries more than the money that is flowing into the country from citizens that are working abroad. Here is a little map that is showing how the inward or outward investment, so that's the foreign direct investment that this country is making outside the world. That will be the left side of this circle. So the shaded dark gray area will be the outward investment. So a country that is investing outside, like the USA, has this shaded area. And the other side will be the inward investment that this country is receiving from investors from the rest of the world. So if we see countries like the USA or Canada, they have almost the same size of investment. We are very simplifying a lot what I'm about to mention in terms of GNP, but if we take only into consideration the investment and then the repatriation of profits that this investment will take eventually in the future, then that will help us to understand that idea of the GDP versus the GNP related with the inflow and outflow of, in this case, will be profits repatriated. So think about a country like Mexico, or many countries in the Southern Hemisphere. We may see Latin America. This is quite old. This is 2001, but still is useful for this example. So Brazil or Mexico, or we can see here, for example, China, some countries in African continent, that they will have actually a larger amount of inwards investment. That means that foreign investment is bigger than the investment that these countries are sending to the rest of the world. So let's say foreign local investors investing in firms abroad. So if we just simplify the situation here, we may say, well, what would happen when these firms that are investing in Brazil repatriate their profits back to the USA or to Europe, where these firms may be coming from? So that will mean that the GDP of Brazil will be bigger than its GNP, because the GNP will actually make the outflow of profits bigger, and the inflow of profits of this small amount of firms investing in the rest of the world, Brazilian firms investing in the rest of the world, would be smaller in terms of what they are repatriating back to Brazil. So this is, again, very simplistic because it doesn't really mean exactly what I'm saying, but this is a very visual way to say how the GDP and GNP is very related also with the level of investment that a country is receiving. On the other hand, we may also talk about the level of workers that are migrating. So it's not only firms, but also let's think about all the workers in these countries that actually are migrating to the north, that actually they provide jobs. They migrate because of that. They want to work in those countries. But then what those countries do, they add into their GDP that working earnings or the earnings of those wages. But when the wages are repatriated to these countries, also that happens a lot over here, So that will be subtracted from their GNP. So the GNP also has to do with the repatriation of wages that usually is coming in terms of, or in a form of, we call it remittances, okay? So remittances means the amount of money that workers send back home as a proportion of their salaries. This is an interesting graph that is just showing how foreign investment in some countries is actually increasing the GDP of those countries, but that doesn't mean that the GNP actually is bigger or the money is staying in those countries. That means that maybe when these countries repatriate their profits back to their home countries, then the GNP will be smaller in these African countries that reflect a bigger or a larger GDP. So now we have a summary, the difference between GDP and GNP. Now we say that because of profits, rents, interest payment, and worker remittances, or the wages of workers being sent back home to where they are actually the countries where they are from, that flow of factor payments will reduce the GDP or increase the GDP, and then we have the new concept, which is the gross national product, the GNP. So the GNP could be bigger than the GDP if the inflow of the factor payments, the net inflow is bigger than the net outflow of these factors payments. So that means that when the factor payments are added up, it will be giving us a larger amount in terms of GNP compared to what was produced inside the boundaries of that country. And the opposite is also true, where the example of the map that I just showed you. If the inflows are smaller than the outflows, so that means that there's more money flowing out as repatriation of profits or any source of income that is flowing out of the country in a net value, then that will make the GNP smaller than the GDP of that country that we are analyzing. So that gives us a little bit more of a clear information about the money that is actually staying in the country once the profits or wages or sources of income have been taken into consideration in this measurement. So for example, this is in Philippines. We can see how the GNP and the GDP have the same trend over time. So we have the same fluctuations. There are some seasonal fluctuations, or there may be a trend that is telling us, well, this country is growing over the long run. But when we separate the GDP versus the GNP, now we can tell that the money that is staying in the Philippines is smaller, or is a smaller amount than what they produce inside their boundaries measured by the GDP. Okay, so that means that there's more net income flowing out than what the people from the Philippines are receiving from the rest of the world because of Filipinos sending money back to the country. Now let's make a short exercise here. So I would like you to work for 2 minutes in measuring the GDP of this country, but we're going to be using the expenditure method. Remember, the expenditure method is related with the aggregate demand as we define it. So the aggregate demand is everything that the country spends. And remember that it has to do with the households expenditure, which is the personal consumption, as we call it. So consumption will be the big C. What else is part of the aggregate demand? Remember? So who else spends money in an economy? We also said the firms. The firms, they want to invest. So investment. Who else spends in the economy? The government. The government expenditure is also related with the big aggregate demand measurement. So government expenditure, as we defined it before, talks about expenditure in health services, roads, infrastructure, education, everything that the government is actually providing as a good or as a service, merit goods or public goods that the government is spending. And the last one is what we talk about, the export revenue. Remember that what the rest of the world is buying from us, minus the import expenditure. We need to make the minus import because this has to be subtracted from the economy because it's actually what we spend from the rest of the world that has to be subtracted from our income. It's a flow out of the system. Remember, it's a leakage that is not coming back in any form. And then actually what we have here is an injection that is actually injected because of selling to the rest of the world. So now we see our AD formula. Remember, I told you, if you want to memorize something in economics, memorize this. But we need more than memorize to understand what this is about. C plus I plus G plus net exports, X minus M. So please work on your task. You can pause this right now. I'm gonna go to the answers. So now we have the answer here. And again, we may find out that all these values that we see here correspond to what the information that this table is providing us. This table was also trying to confuse us by giving us also some other information. If we were asked to calculate the GDP from the income method, remember the income would be the factor income. So all the factor of production or all the payments of the factor of production should be accounted if we want to calculate the GDP from their income method. Now, we don't have all the factors of production incomes here. We just have wages and salaries, we have profits, but we don't have rent, and actually we don't have also interest rates. So we cannot calculate the factor income accurately here with this information. The other information would be the output method, remember. The output is the total sellings or the total sales of goods and services expressed in monetary terms that the country is making or producing, in other words. So the final goods produced and sold, plus the net change of inventories. So inventories will be what you produced but you didn't sell. That has to be accounted in the output method. But right now we're looking just at the expenditure method, okay, the aggregate demand. Because we have the information from the expenditure method in this table, we can use that. So what information do we have? We have the government expenditure, yeah. We also have, let's say, import of goods and services, okay, this is a negative thing that we want to add in our equation, okay. What else do we have? Factor income earned and received from abroad. Well, this is going to be useful if we calculate the GNP. Investment, okay, so the investment expenditure is our I. Factor income paid abroad, so this is for GNP, this is not right now useful. Exports of goods and services, so we need to add this as our X. Wages, profits, unemployment benefits, subsidies, these are actually not useful for our expenditure method, but our big C, consumer expenditure, is what we need to add here. So now we have C plus I plus G plus X minus M. And these values that we have here are the ones corresponding to the values that we have here. And that should be your answer. Sorry, this is correct here. Okay. So your answer will be 295,000 millions of US dollars. So 6 billion US dollars. In other words, we want to look at what are we talking about. Please reflect the amount because this is telling us in millions. So we need to mention that it's millions in our answer. And we also need to mention that it's expressed in monetary terms. And in this case, the unit is the US dollar. The second part of the question was about calculate the GNP of this country. Now that we have the GDP, what we need to add? We need to add the net factor income. And we just mentioned on the last couple of slides that the net factor income could be net negative or could be net positive, okay? Depending if the money is flowing in more than the money is flowing out, or if we have a net outflow of money from residents from abroad sending back money compared to what we receive from our citizens producing abroad. So now in this particular case, we have here the factor income, the net factor income is what, smaller? Yeah, it's actually more negative. If we take the GDP and we add this net value, then we have our GNP, which will be this amount that we have here. That means that this is the money that is coming to the country and is staying to the country, and it's actually a real or a more close information about what the country really produces when the money is taken back from citizens abroad and we are repatriating the profits from foreign companies or foreign citizens that are sending it back home. So this is what we need to calculate. This is the type of questions that you will receive in a paper 3, but this is more important to know what we are talking about. Let's finish this concept of GDP and GNP, trying to define the last concept, which is called the net national income, okay? So the net national income has a difference when we talk about gross national income or net national income. So what's the difference between this idea of gross and net? So when we are mentioning gross or GDP or GNP, we are actually considering that the machinery that we are using does not depreciate. So that's why we call it gross, because we are just talking, or we are assuming that the machine that we are using every year is new, but that is not true. And I'm gonna mention not just the machinery, but also the buildings. So that is not true. Buildings deteriorate and machinery deteriorates. So we can see that, for example, in this picture. Yeah, so if we're thinking about the tractors or the buildings or the machines that a factory is using, those are actually starting to wear off as they are used over time. So if we want to measure the real amount of money that a country is making in a year, we need to subtract that depreciation of the machinery or the capital goods that the country has. Why? Because it will be not true to think that everything in the country is always new, okay? And I'm gonna make a simple example here. Let's think that Pearson College is a country and we are measuring the real value of the assets of Pearson College. And the assets are all the money that Pearson College has in the bank, but also the buildings that Pearson College has, and also the vehicles that Pearson College has. So all of that is part of the amount of money that Pearson College values, or the value of the college itself expressed in monetary terms. So what if we actually take into consideration, let's think about Victoria House. So Victoria House is deteriorated and it has to be renewed, okay? So if we value Victoria House with the same amount of money that East House has, so we're comparing two houses, one is new and the other one is already almost not useful, it's deteriorated. So actually we need to subtract the deterioration of that house to know really the value of the assets of Pearson College. So the same idea will be here in a country. We need to know really how much money do we have in a country when we subtract the deterioration of all the assets, or in this case, all the capital goods that actually deteriorate when they are used to produce other goods. So then we talk about, this is when we're talking about the net concept of the net national income. Instead of talking about the gross national income, now we're gonna subtract the depreciation of whatever capital goods are used in a country. So when we take away that depreciation, then we convert from gross to net, okay? So the net national income is the GNP minus the depreciation, or the net domestic income is the GDP, the gross domestic product, minus the depreciation. So some people call it the net national product or the net domestic product, but we're talking about income because at the end of the day, we're saying that the product and the income is the same amount, is the same value. Doesn't really matter how do you mention it. So how to calculate the depreciation of something? So let's say if a building has a certain value, okay, and is destroyed over 10 years, so we divide it, and each year we're gonna be subtracting actually the amount of the depreciation of this building per year. In 10 years, that building should be replaced, okay, because it has lost value by a certain percentage. In this case, we're saying 20% because in 10 years, 10%, sorry, because in 10 years, the building is going to be destroyed by 10% each year. So we need to subtract that destruction of the building or that wear out of the machinery that each year is happening. So that's a formula that we don't really need to think about how to make it, but the formula is being given by the governments. They say, you know, buildings will have 10 years of lifetime, vehicles will have 5 years of lifetime, depending on the country and depending on the context of the production. The government will have a table which tells you how much years do you have to depreciate your capital goods. Sometimes it's 50 years, sometimes it's 30 years, sometimes it's 10 years, depending on the type of business and depending on the type of capital goods that we're mentioning or talking about. Now, you have to report that if you're a business owner, you have to report the depreciation to the government. And the government will say, okay, now we have the GDP, now we have the GNP, now we take away the depreciation that has been reported from all the factories and companies in the country. Now we have our real amount of income that the country is really producing when we take away that depreciation. So that's the idea of converting from the GDP to the net national income. So you have a reading that you can actually consult, and the idea will be coming from the GDP to the GNP to the NNP or NNI, as we call it. So it's the same thing. So this is it. So now we know GDP is the sum of, let's say, the aggregate demand. We mentioned how, if we have this information, or the total income or the total output. GNP will be the GDP plus the net factor income from abroad. And now we have the GNP converting it into NNP. So the net, instead of the gross national product, will be the GNP minus the amount that is giving us as a depreciation of all the capital goods that the country has been wearing and using over time. Okay. So let's move on, because the concept is what we need to understand. I will give you later in the term some exercises to work from GDP, calculate the GNP, and then calculate the net national income, given the values that the IB or is going to be giving to you in terms of the amount of the depreciation of all this machinery. They will give you a number. So now we have here the summary of what we just said. You can pause it and just think about it and reflect about it. And let's move now to inflation. I'm going to make a new video about inflation in 1 second.